about a month ago. I'm very happy to be here. I want to tell you a little bit about myself. So I went to school at Utah State, and I started there in 1990, and I finally graduated with a bachelor's in 2002. And in between all that time that I was in school, I was taking jobs doing system administration and whatnot. I spent about 6 months teaching Unix system administration in Salt Lake, and then I went back to school for a while, and then got a job as a sysadmin somewhere, and then I went back to school. So it took me 12 years to get my bachelor's. But the reason I'm telling you this history, my own little brief history of my open source experience before we get into the meat and potatoes of my presentation. So when I was at school, everybody had an account on the VAX. Has everybody heard of a VAX before? Okay, so VAX was a mini computer. Mini computers then were quite large, but it was a mini computer that the school used that everybody had an email account on, and it ran an operating system called VMS. It was made by a company called Digital Electronics Corporation, DEC. And I got to be pretty good with the VAX. And eventually I got a job as a lab consultant in one of the computer labs on campus. The VMS is kind of like Unix in the sense that it's a multi-user operating system. But everything is, you know, where Unix took the philosophy of make the commands as short as possible. So if you want to do a long directory listing in Linux or Unix, you do an ls-l. And on VMS, you would type directory/verbose or something like that. It would be this huge, long, but the ability to do those kind of things was the same. It was all command line, and you could do everything. You just had to type a lot more. And VMS was very tightly controlled by DEC. There were a couple people on campus that had bookshelves of manuals, and so I got to be friends with them, and I went in and borrowed these binders full of documentation and taught myself about VMS. And then after a year and a half or so of that, I started learning about Ultrix, which was DEC's Unix implementation. So this is 91, 92, and then I got access to the Sun Lab. You know, Sun Microsystems workstations in there. So I learned about SunOS and then later Solaris. SunOS was a BSD Unix, and Solaris was a System 5 Unix, both produced by Sun Microsystems. And then I spent 6 months teaching system administration for this company in Salt Lake. And then in '94 was when I first learned about Linux. And in '95 was one of these times when I went back to school, and I got a job on campus doing system administration for the continuing education department. And they had me running a server, I think it was an email server running Unixware. And Unixware was a product that Novell created once they bought the System 5 Unix product. So I remember one thing that I did there was I had to compile a new version of Sendmail for this Unixware server, and I could not get it to compile. By the way, this Unixware server was just like an Intel 486 or something like that. It wasn't anything special hardware-wise. But what I discovered was people online were saying, well, yeah, it's difficult to compile Sendmail for Unixware, but it compiles really well for Linux. And so I talked to my boss. I said, I think we should put Linux on this server instead of Unixware. I know you spent money on a Unixware license, but I think we might be happier with Linux. And so he let me do it, and sure enough, Linux was a lot easier to work with. And I've been using Linux pretty much as my main operating system. I started using it as a desktop probably around 2000 or so. and I'm running Linux here. I used Mac for a couple of years because my employer gave me a Mac and said I had to use it, and I was able to get by. Mac is very Unix-like, especially if once you get that terminal open, you're home. In fact, Derek said the first thing he's going to teach on next Tuesday is how to use a mouse, and I'm like, why do you need to know how to use a mouse? He's like, well, you need to click on the terminal app. So anyway, so enough about me. I've been using Linux since 94, 95, and I was exposed to open source software as early as 1990. And I've been involved in the open source community since the mid-90s and conferences. When I was at USU, we had our free software in Linux club around about 98, 99, and we had our first conference. We had the Free Software in Linux Forum, and we invited Richard Stallman to come and speak at our conference. And a lot of these open source luminaries, they will come and speak at your conference, often for free, as long as you give them a place to, to sleep and feed them or whatever. Sometimes they'll say, just pay for my airfare and whatnot, and they'll come and do that. So our first conference was Richard Stallman's. We had Perrins, what's his first name? Anyway, he's one of the guys behind the Debian project. He also worked for Pixar, and he had some code fly on the space shuttle. Very interesting guy. And so anyway, and then I've been involved with Utah Open Source. Lately, I do a lot of videos for different groups. I've been involved with Open West doing a lot of their video stuff. And I know a couple of you came to my presentation last year about using open source video tools, doing video editing and stuff like that in Linux. So, any questions before we get started? I work at Bluehost now. I'm a Perl developer and kind of a back-end systems admin, whatnot. Okay. So I wanted to go back to the, oh, you can't even see that. Dang it. That says 1950s. I wonder if there's a way we can. There we go. That works better. I tried. I was trying. Okay. So I want to take you guys back to the 1950s and 60s. If you've done some studying of history of computers in general, you know that the first real computers came about during World War II. I think pretty much everybody was doing something computer-wise. We know the Alan Turing was working for the British, trying to break the encryption that the Germans were using. And we were doing the same thing here in the US. One of the first commercially produced computers after World War II was the A2 by Univac. And the A2 was released to the customers with its source code. Now back then, source code was pretty much just binary. But they gave them, here's the binary, you can do what you want with it. And so the A2 was the first example of free and open source software. And then COBOL, this picture over here, does anybody know who Grace Hopper is? Does that name ring a bell? A little bit? You've heard of Grace Hopper? Okay. So Grace Hopper worked for the Navy during World War II. And this is her, a picture of her. She worked for the Navy in World War II on the Mark II computer, which was, the architecture of this computer is really fascinating because it was a mechanically driven computer it was like an electromechanical computer. So it had like a shaft that went through it that turned, and then the programmers would go in and wire circuits that would get activated as it turned. I don't really understand it, but it was a novel concept, nothing like what became the Turing architecture that all of our computers today use. But she worked on that, and then she went on to work for Univac and a bunch of other companies, and she is known as kind of like the creator of the COBOL language, which is still in use today, primarily in business programs. But so COBOL was also, the beginning of COBOL was very much, let's share the code. If you have ideas, contribute back, that sort of thing. And another interesting thing about Grace Hopper is, we were talking briefly about this before the meeting, about women in technology. When Grace Hopper was working on COBOL and things like that, and during World War II, a lot of women were involved doing computer programming. And part of that was because in the 20s and 30s leading up to World War II, there were a lot of women who studied math and sciences in the universities. It wasn't until after World War II that there were some cultural shifts, and I don't know, women were kind of said, well, you gotta let those boys coming back from the war have the jobs. You go home, raise a family, whatnot. So there were some cultural shifts. But up until that point, there were a lot of women involved in early computer technology. Okay, so IBM, as we know, was making early computers. They had a user group called Share, founded in 1955, and it was basically just a user group for people that used their IBM supercomputers. And they distributed its operating systems in source form. I imagine back then it was tape. I don't mean like magnetic tape, I mean like paper tape or punch cards. And so IBM would distribute its operating systems in source form, and the Share users would share and distribute modifications. Now I mentioned the VAX and the VMS operating system. DEC had some systems as well, and they also created DECUS, which was their Digital Equipment Computer User Society, founded in 1961. The DEC employees were encouraged to participate, but they couldn't be members. So it was mostly, the membership consisted entirely of customers. And they also promoted the open exchange of user-developed software, largely via magnetic tape. So you'd come to these meetings and you'd say, hey, I like what you're doing, send me a copy of that, and then you get a box with reels of tape that you could play with. 1969 was a pivotal year for a few different reasons. One of those is there in the picture there. Man lands on the moon. Has anybody looked at the Apollo guidance computer code? You can get it, it's like on GitHub or something. They released it in 2009 into the public domain. It was programmed using punch cards, and yeah, in 2009 the source code was released. The computer itself had a 1 megahertz clock speed, so not blazingly fast. And the guidance computer is another. There's a story there. I don't remember her name, but there's I saw a story like about a month ago. There was a woman that worked on that. She was from MIT, and there's a picture of her. She's probably 5'4", and she's standing next to these printouts, just stacks of paper that are about up to her head, that went into the Apollo guidance computer. It's pretty cool. Also in 1969 was the birth of the ARPANET. And the ARPANET was what later became the Internet. ARPA stands for the Advanced Research Projects Agency. It was part of the Department of Defense. They wanted to create a computer network by which they could connect remote computer installations across the country. The University of Utah was one of the first nodes on the ARPANET. And then other schools within the state of Utah connected through that. It was designed by engineers at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, which is BBN in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the standards and protocols used in this fledgling network were designed in an open, collaborative fashion. And the way that they did it was they would publish an RFC, or a request for comments. And that is still how protocols are ratified on the internet today. Somebody will publish an RFC and say, this is what I think this new fandangled protocol should look like. and other people give their input, and it becomes a draft, and then it becomes ratified as an official protocol. Okay, so in 1969, Unix comes about. So the story of Unix, Unix was born in Bell Labs in New Jersey. Ken Thompson was a researcher there, and he'd been working on an operating system called Multics. And Multics was an ambitious effort between Bell Labs and MIT and General Electric. And they had, Multics had this goal of supporting like hundreds of users. Imagine that, hundreds of users using one computer. But once they got it off the ground, it had trouble supporting 3. And so the companies that were involved in Multics just kind of pulled out. And Ken Thompson was one of the researchers, and he thought Multics had some really good concepts that they could put to use. And so he went back to his desk or whatever and started working on a new implementation, a new operating system using some of those concepts that they got by working on Multics, and came up with the name for it, Unix. Unix doesn't stand for anything. It's kind of a play on Multics. He did that. He got the first version of Unix running on a DEC PDP-7, which was a little refrigerator-sized mini computer that Digital Equipment made. Also in 1969, a guy named Linus Torvalds was born in Helsinki, Finland. Okay, so now we're into the 1970s. Unix is developed by AT&T Bell Labs, so it was created. Somebody decided that they can make this into a product they can sell. At first it was distributed for free to academic and government researchers, and they were encouraged to give back. If you have some ideas on how to make it better, go ahead and let us know. In 1973, Unix was rewritten in a brand new programming language called C. And this...
Quick question, what was it written in beforehand? It was
like assembly.
Oh boy.
Yeah, it was written pretty close to the hardware, and that made it difficult. It pretty much only ran on the PDP-7. So if you had a PDP-7, you were in luck. If you didn't, you weren't in so much luck. And so that was one thing that once they had the operating system rewritten in C, then all you needed was a C compiler for your hardware, and then you could run Unix on that hardware as well. So by 1974, the whole environment had been successfully ported to several different machines. And then Thompson gave his first public presentation about Unix in 1973, and people at the University of California, Berkeley noticed, and they asked for a copy of the source code to be sent there. And then in 1975, Ken Thompson went and did a kind of a sabbatical at University of California, Berkeley. And he spent some time improving and building on top of Unix there. I think it was a year and a half that he was there. 1980s. I don't know. You guys were probably born maybe in the late 80s? Early 90s? I don't know.
Early 90s.
Okay.
By the time you went to college?
So we're just about to where I was born. I was born in 1972. So so now the 80s, this is like, you know, my childhood here. One thing, and you know, when I was growing up, I never thought about, you know, when I started using computers as a teenager, you pretty much had to buy everything. You had to pay for DOS, you had to pay for Windows, you had to pay for WordPerfect, you had to pay for whatever. So, and the reason for that is because during the 80s, closed source dominated. Even Unix, which had been fairly open, there were companies that were taking Unix and closing it off and packaging it up as a commercial product and not letting that open source philosophy thrive. So we had companies like Sun, IBM, HP, SCO, and even DEC create their own versions of a commercialized Unix implementation. And but open source was still there. It thrived, still within as kind of like add-ons for these commercial Unix implementations. I think the C programming language had a lot to do with the success of open source software, because just like how Unix could be ported to different computers, now you had software that could run on different operating systems and different computers as well. One thing that was born during the 80s that made a big difference in open source was Usenet. Who's heard of Usenet? Usenet news groups was really how I was introduced to the internet in the early 90s. News groups it was like bulletin boards, but the idea was that every Usenet server was a distributed copy of everything else that was on other Usenet servers. So it was kind of like the World Wide Web, except when you go to it was kind of like if you wanted to go to a website, you'd have to make sure that your local World Wide Web server had a copy of the website that you wanted to go to.
How many of these existed?
What's that?
How many of these existed?
Like, you know, at the time in the 80s and 90s, the internet was mostly schools and research institutions. So every school would have its own Usenet server.
Really?
Yeah. And this server was, you know, and the news groups was all text. I mean, we weren't sharing, you know, videos and images and stuff. It was all text, and it was all just conversations. And so this was a distributed messaging and collaboration platform, and you'd have groups like CompSys Unix, which was, you know, the Unix operating system discussion, or you'd have Rec Arts Movies, which was kind of a recreational group to talk about films. Then you'd have like Alt Tasteless, which is where people told their tasteless jokes. And there were hundreds, maybe even thousands of these news groups. And it was fun. It was fun. We'll get back to that. And the Usenet was used a protocol called NNTP, which was Network News Transportation Protocol. And it was born for use over TCP/IP, DECnet, which was Digital Equipment's their own networking protocol, and some others. So it actually spanned the internet and some other proprietary networks as well. In addition, there was some UUCP and FidoNet networks, and these worked over dial-up modems. Does anybody remember dial-up modems? Okay. So these were like a store and forward way of communicating. So with UUCP, if you wanted to send email to someone, you'd know their UUCP email address. You'd send them email, and then every night your mail server would dial up to its neighbor on the UUCP network, and they would transfer information. And eventually your message would get to the person you were sending email to, but it might take a day, it might take 2 days before you get a response, because it was all store and forward. FidoNet was the same thing, but it was used primarily for bulletin board systems. It's a way that you could send messages that way. Okay, so now I want to talk about GNU. Who's heard of GNU? Most of you have heard of GNU. Okay. So GNU was the brainchild of Richard Stallman, and GNU is kind of this self-referencing acronym, which you see a lot in open source. GNU stands for GNU's not Unix, but in fact, it was. So Richard Stallman, also known by his username RMS, worked for the MIT Media Lab, what became the Media Lab. I don't remember what it was called before it was the Media Lab. But he worked for the MIT laboratory, and he tells a story of they got a printer, and he wanted to be able to print to the printer, and the system that he was using didn't have support by the printer manufacturer. And so he called the printer manufacturer and said, I want to write software for this system, and would you give me the specifications? And they wouldn't. They said, you'll have to wait till if and when we produce drivers for this operating system. He was probably using some Unix or something like that. And so he talks about the frustration, that this was just one example of frustration that he encountered continually. And the frustration was born not just from hardware manufacturers, but then all these commercial Unix companies as well. You had to convince them that it was in their best interest to produce software for your hardware or for your needs. And so he said, we're gonna create our own operating system called Canoe. And he announced it in September 1983 on this news group called Net Unix Wizards. And I think, let's see, the next. Okay, so here's his announcement. He says, hey, we're going to create a free Unix. We're going to give it away to anybody who wants to use it. If you want to give money, equipment, whatever, you can do that. It'll be a kernel plus all the utilities to write and run C programs, because that's what you need to produce an operating system. You need to be able to compile C programs. So we'll have a shell, we'll have an editor, we'll have a C compiler, obviously, and more and more and more. We'll have some games. He says GNU will be able to run Unix programs, but not be identical to Unix. And we're just going to, we may have something like UUCP, he says. What's interesting about this announcement in retrospect is that the kernel, he says the kernel is the first thing that they would produce. Well, they really haven't even released a kernel. I mean, they've got something, but it hasn't like really been successful. But what really came out of the GNU project were all of the utilities that you would need for an operating system, like Bash, the born-again shell, which was a replacement for the Bourne shell that came with your System 5 Unix. VI, your text editor. All the GNU file utilities like CP and MV and LS, all those things, they were produced as part of this project for an open source operating system. And once you put those on top of something like the Linux kernel, you have a fully functioning operating system. Okay, so now I get to tell you guys about my own experience with Richard Stallman. There's a little deviation from the history, but it's a fun story. So let me get this out. As I mentioned before, we had this conference up at Utah State. We invited Richard Stallman in 1999 to come and speak to us. And my buddy Chad, who's a writer, went with me to the Salt Lake Airport to pick up Richard Stallman from the airport and drive him up to Logan. And I was really excited to meet Richard Stallman, but after that 2-hour drive, I didn't want anything to do with this guy. And the same thing with my buddy Chad. So I'm gonna read this. This is the story as written by Chad, and then you guys will know about Richard. Richard is a brilliant guy, but like a lot of people who spend most of their time with computers, a little socially awkward. That's kind of an understatement. But. So concerning the RMS run, I'd forgotten a lot about that night on purpose. I'll tell you what I remember. It'll probably contain hyperbole and inaccuracies. I take that back, not probably, certainly. What I remember best is that RMS was simply unpleasant, supercilious, judgmental, and worst of all, oblivious to his own behavior. Basically, he was a jerk. At the time, Doran and I were excited about the free software movement. I was under the impression that RMS was some sort of Yoda of free software, so I was eager to make a good impression. I tried to be friendly and as charming as I could be. Doran was the same. We helped RMS carry his baggage. We opened doors for him. We made everything as easy as possible. But all of these efforts were utterly wasted. RMS regarded us the same way he regarded Doran's car. We were merely background utilities necessary for conveying the priceless treasure of his intellect from place to place. He was a textbook messiah. If we genuflected at his feet and kissed the hem of his raiment, he would not even as much as flinched. RMS moved about cautiously, as though he knew he was very fragile and that something close by could easily injure him. He couldn't do anything swiftly. He walked, sat down, and spoke only after a slow flurry of sighing, eye-blinking, and hand-waving. His beard was thin and wispy back then, and his skin was pallid, like he'd never been exposed to sunshine, ever. His hands were pudgy, creamy, and as soft as a baby's, but his fingernails were long and yellow. He never made eye contact, not that I remember. Instead, he was always gazing into the middle distance with a heavy-lidded, semi-dazed expression, as though he was receiving continuous revelation from God. He did not speak, he intoned. He orated in a prophetic, messianic way. This worked okay when he said things like, "The problem with selling things is that you have to ask for money." But it was less impressive when he said things like, "I urgently need to go to the bathroom," or "I like Skittles." He reminded me of a softer, paler, shorter version of Jesus Christ. We placed RMS in Doran's car and gingerly arranged him so that he seemed satisfied that nothing in the vehicle would puncture or otherwise disturb him, and we started on our way to Logan. Doran and I tried valiantly to be sociable with RMS. We are and were both versed in a variety of conversation topics, relevant and obscure, and were quick to laugh. No one could have asked for more pleasant company on a 90-minute car ride, but again, we were practically beneath his notice. He tolerated us as one might suffer a dog licking himself in the corner of a room, and so the conversation in the car was at first largely between Doran and I. Yes, he lectured Doran for using a credit card. I can't even remember the reason, privacy or something. The funny thing is, he also claimed that he didn't have any cash with him, so I paid for him to get a bottle of water to drink, whereupon he lectured me on the evils of bottled water. And he never paid me back. Richard Stallman still owes me $1.81. When we got back in the car, RMS produced a cassette tape and ordered Doran to play it. He handed it to Doran and said, "Play this." Even I had started using CDs and MP3 players by this time, but the digital Yoda pulls-out cassette that appears to have been around since the advent of magnetic tape. It was Ukrainian folk music, which sounded like a cat fight, set to music and then played at two times the normal speed. I think I have some. Both sides of the tape were just one unceasing song, but there were certain passages of it that RMS evidently found quite moving. You knew when he was going to getting into his jam because he tilted his head back and waved his hands dreamily. He had no compunction over cutting someone off mid-sentence to draw attention to the ghastly strains of his music, but he wouldn't be caught dead doing something as primeval and mindless as working the knobs of an automobile stereo. That's what the troglodyte humanoids around him were for. So yeah, he gestured at the stereo and insisted that Doran make this louder, increase the volume. And he acted the same with respect to the car heater and other things. "My body has become cold. Can something be done to raise the ambient temperature within this vehicle?" He also killed conversation by making these finalistic, irrefutable statements, so Doran might be in the middle of a claim about server networking speeds when RMS would suddenly silence him with a statement about how copyrights were contributing to the problem of noise pollution. I'd mentioned the term open source, and he'd say, "No, free software." Another time I'd say free software, and he'd say, "You mean open source?" Every exchange ended with RMS correcting our opinions or word choice. From time to time, RMS did ask us questions, especially when he observed things he did not approve of, and he approved of almost nothing. There were aspects of the Salt Lake airport that he wasn't too happy about, for example. I don't remember what exactly, but he seemed to think that Doran and I were there to forward all his complaints to the state of Utah. At one point, we drove past a huge gravel quarry in the side of the mountain on the north side of Salt Lake City. This was late at night, and yet there were a swarm of earth-moving equipment working in the pit under the harsh glare of sodium arc lighting. RMS apparently found this offensive for some reason, because he raised his plump and silky hands to make an annoyed, perplexed gesture in that direction and said, "What is this? What is happening here?" "They're doing a huge overhaul of the interstate right now," I said. "They're working on it around the clock." "Why is that?" RMS asked. "I don't know," I said. "I guess no one's told them they could move the clock." I thought that was pretty clever. I think Doran chuckled. RMS thought about it for a few seconds. Then he smiled, nodded his head, and said, "Ha ha." It was like he was not actually human, but had been briefed on how to act to the primitive custom of humor. He killed most of our other attempts at humor, saying, "Ah, I see," he'd say, "double meaning, quite amusing." The funny thing is, RMS himself tried to make a few attempts at humor, but the punchlines were so abstract and insular that we had no idea what he was talking about, so we too had to respond with mechanical smiles and hollow laughter. After a while, the stereo volume and the heater were running at more or less maximum output, and we drove along without speaking while RMS swayed to his folk music. We reached Logan and went to the apartment of this kid named Ray, whose great honor it was to have RMS lodge with him. Ray was even more worshipful of RMS than Doran and I had been. RMS was Ray's hero, I guess. So we pulled up. When we pulled up, Ray was waiting out in the front yard. It was the middle of night by then, and Ray was literally jumping up and down with excitement. Of course, RMS greeted Ray the same way he might greet a mailbox or a shrub. He looked in Ray's direction. He may have nodded, but that was it. And then RMS intoned, to no one specifically, "I require a room with a door and one vacuum cleaner and a pan with some water in it." And then he walked off in the direction of Ray's apartment. At the time, the request struck me as hilarious because I was trying unsuccessfully to picture the rest of his evening. Like maybe he vacuumed himself off in the night instead of showering, or something weirder. Turns out RMS always traveled with an air mattress that he can inflate with a vacuum hose. And then he would like wash his hair using a pan of water. Ray must have detected that Doran and I were anxious to get rid of RMS because he shrugged questioningly to ask us what the matter was. We just rolled our eyes and waved him off as if to say, he's your problem now. And then we got the heck out of there. Next time I saw Ray, he looked so defeated that I might have otherwise guessed he'd been repeatedly traumatized, but I knew what had actually happened. I'd spent only a couple of hours being questioned, lectured, and corrected by RMS. Ray got that treatment for a couple of days. And that's just about how everyone on campus came into contact with RMS Act 2. Everyone just wanted to go home and never come back. So there you go. Richard Stallman, nice guy, not really. But we owe him a debt of gratitude for what he did for the open source movement. Here's another interesting picture of Richard, and another interesting picture of Richard. Here's actually video from us picking him up at the airport. There he is at our Free Software and Linux forum. This is interesting because we had talked to some book companies like O'Reilly and some other book companies, and they had sent us some boxes of books to give away at this conference. Well, Richard wouldn't stand for it. He said, "You got to get rid of those books because they're proprietary, copyrighted books. You can't give those away at a free software conference." So this is at Linux World and Expo in 2000, or maybe this was 1999 in San Jose, the Sweet 16 party for Linux. Richard was there on a panel with some other people. So some other early free software. Has anybody used Spice? It's like a circuit design. This was open source. Started in the 80s. Text is a layout language, which still has, there's a lot of software out there. Like I use
Like LaTeX?
Yes. Yeah. So I use a desktop publishing app called Scribus, and it's based on LaTeX. My calling in my ward is the sacrament programs, and so I use Scribus to do that. And then of course the X Window system, which is the basis for the graphical user interface on Unix systems, was also some free software. So now we're up to the 90s, 1991. Linux is born. Here's a picture of young Linus Torvalds. In August 26th, he put something up on a news group on Usenet, Comp OS Minix. Minix was a kind of a proof of concept Unix clone for the 386 computer. And Linus came up with something that was like Minix, and so he posted some information to this news group. And then later in '92, Linux is released under the GNU public license, the GPL. So this was his announcement. Hello everyone out there using Minix. I'm doing a free operating system, just a hobby. Won't be anything big and professional like GNU, which GNU still really hasn't become anything worth mentioning other than all the utilities. This has been brewing since April, and I'm starting to get it ready. I'd like some feedback. Anything that you don't like or you do like about Minix, maybe I can add that. He's got Bash and GCC ported, and he says it doesn't use any Minix code. You know, he's asking for help, and people started downloading it and using it. Linux was born, and now it's everywhere. Early Linux history. In October 1991, 63K compressed. Excuse me while I consume some Swedish fish. I'm diabetic and my blood sugar is tanking right now. So. If I collapse, we'll just take a break. Okay, so let's go through this history. January 92, 108K. March 92, 116K. Now you got to remember, this growth in size is because of all the contributions that Linus was receiving from people. Another thing that today you probably wouldn't have thought of is that it wasn't until version 0.98 that Linux had any support for TCP/IP networking. So up until that point, you would download these floppy images and put them on the computer, and you could use the stuff on the computer, but the computer couldn't talk to anything else. In version 0.98, so we're coming up on that, September 92, Alan Cox and Fred Van Kempen created an alpha implementation of TCP/IP for Linux. And Linus, we had these competing networking stacks for Linux, and Linus kind of sorted that out. Meanwhile, I think Linus chose Alan Cox's implementation, and Fred Van Kempen was kind of miffed about that. Meanwhile, the guy who created Minix, his name was Andrew Tannenbaum, just kept posting things to the news group saying Linux was doomed to fail. See, it's growing quite a bit. Yeah, like I said, in version 0.98, we had a networking stack, very alpha level networking stack. But as you can imagine, once people started using that opened the door for a lot more development. Finally, version 1.0 in March of 1994. Who was born? Anybody? Anybody born in 94? Okay. I had to do some math here. Okay, that makes you, okay. Some early Linux distributions. The first one that I used was Slackware. But prior to Slack, this SLS, I don't even know how you say this. This, you got Jurasil, anyway. So these early Linux distributions, you would get a couple of floppies. You'd have a boot floppy and a root floppy, and then that would give you a really bare bones Linux system. And then if you wanted the X window system, that was 5 more floppies. You'd download the floppy set, and you write those to 5 floppies. If you wanted the VI editor or Emacs, that'd be a couple of floppies. And so you were sitting there with all these floppies based on what you wanted. So Slackware was built on top of SLS. Debian and Red Hat both kind of came on the scene about the same time. So Ian Murdoch created Debian. He used the name of his wife, Deborah, and his name, Ian, and came up with Debian. Mark Ewing was a student in North Carolina. He created the Red Hat distribution in 1993. Everything was GPL. They're still very devoted to the GPL, the GNU public license. Caldera was also another early distribution. It was created as a project at Novell here in Utah Valley, headed by a guy named Brian Sparks, and it was funded by Ray Norda, who's the president of Novell. Here's Linus. I think this picture was probably around 1996, and he's showing off that Linux was running on a little Sony laptop. Here's some video that I shot at Linux World in '99. Like I said, this was kind of the Sweet 16, because at this point, Red Hat had its IPO. People were really starting to notice Linux. It was an exciting time in the Linux community, because Linux was starting to get funding left and right. We talked about the .com crash in the early 2000s. This was at the height of the bubble.
Even though I joke about automation, I also think that the exhibition.
What's interesting is this is the same panel that we saw Richard Stallman sitting in on, and Richard Stallman was very critical of Linus when it came to how Linux should proceed. Linus's philosophy was, you don't need to use Linux. Just use it if it's something that provides value to you. Just use what you want. And whereas Richard Stallman was adamant that everybody uses free software. He didn't like the term open source. His term was free software. Here's a photo that I was reluctant to bring, but Linus has some strong opinions. This is, as you can tell, it's modified to protect the innocent. But
Is that the one where you were talking about NVIDIA?
yes.
Okay.
Linus has some very strong opinions, but in the case of whether or not you should use open source, he doesn't care. Use what you want. But when it comes to the Linux kernel, he's very, very protective of some of the things that go on there. So we can go back and talk a little bit about, we talked about the fact that Ken Thompson went and spent a couple of years at University of California, Berkeley. While he was there, this new Unix kind of fermented and was born there, and it became known as the Berkeley software distribution. And in 1993, Unix System Labs and Berkeley Software Distribution settled a lawsuit about who owned Unix. And the ownership was granted to the System 5 folks, and that was eventually bought out by Novell, came here, and then SCO bought it. Anyway, this whole thing about commercial and proprietary Unix, it's done. It's over now. But in the 90s, it was still quite a firestorm. There were some free and open implementations of Berkeley software distribution of Linux. NetBSD, FreeBSD, OpenBSD. They're still around today. You can download them, put them on your computer. For the longest time, the Berkeley distributions had a really robust, solid, secure networking stack. Where Linux kind of lagged behind for a long time. It was like, if you want a Unix-like operating system that has solid, secure networking, you want to use BSD. Linux was still kind of regarded as experimental and kind of a hobbyist operating system for a long time because it lagged in networking. But some of you, OpenBSD was where OpenSSH was born. So that's one thing that came out of that project. Let's talk about some important server software that came out. Apache, Perl, PHP. I'm not a fan, but a lot of people use it. Sendmail, Bind, and OpenSSH. We're going to talk about each of those. So Apache, when the World Wide Web came out in 1991, Tim Berners-Lee announced this World Wide Web. Up to this point, people have been using Usenet, and people started. There was another product called Gopher that was kind of like HTTP, but the folks at the NCSA in Illinois came up with their reference implementation of an HTTP server, and that was kind of like the HTTP server that everybody used. Netscape, anybody remember Netscape? Netscape was, they had the first non-NCSA browser. So Netscape came out around, I want to say 93, 94. They came out with the first browser that would let you put JPEG images in a web page. And I remember I was at USU and I was working in a computer lab, and there was an electrical engineering professor that ran the lab, and he told me, he says, this is going to spell the death of the internet. People are going to start putting JPEG images everywhere. The internet can't handle all that traffic. But it's more robust than he thought, because now we have streaming video, we have Netflix, whatnot. But back then there was a lot of concern that the introduction of JPEG into the HTTP spec was just going to kill everything. But yeah, Netscape hired a lot of the engineers away from NCSA, and that led to stagnant development of the HTTP server. Brian Beneldorf was working for Hotwired. Hotwired was the online version of Wired magazine. Anybody seen Wired magazine before? Okay. So Wired magazine started, I want to say 92, 93. Right away they had like an online component. And so Brian started the Apache project in early 1995. And he used an earlier version of NCSA's web server as the basis, and he created Apache version 0.62. And Apache went on to kind of become the big elephant of web servers. Now it seems like, if you're going to fire up a web server, you might do Apache, but there's others. There's Nginx. There's kind of self-running implementations. Every language has its own HTTP server that they spin up for testing purposes. But Apache's still pretty useful. Sendmail was, for the longest time, it was the mail server that anybody used. It was developed by Eric Allman, who was working at Berkeley and worked with Ken Thompson, originally to relay mail between different networks, like ARPANET, other networks. I don't know who that was. And then DARPA standardized. DARPA was the Department of Defense that was, they were in charge of this network, the ARPANET. They standardized everything on BSD Unix, and BSD shipped with Eric Allman's Sendmail. And Sendmail had an incredibly versatile configuration, almost too versatile. When O'Reilly first started publishing their O'Reilly books with the animals on the cover for everything, the Sendmail book was the Bat book, and it was the thickest one. It was like 850 pages or something like that. Let's take a break right now so that you guys can get your fill of this hot steaming pizza, and then I will continue. Okay. Now that we've had our pizza, we can continue. Bind. Is anybody familiar with Bind? Bind is kind of the granddaddy of. There we go. The web app creates its own alarms. Bind is kind of the granddaddy of name services. So this is a name server, domain name server. This is the Berkeley Internet Name Daemon. And like Sendmail, it was included in the early BSD distribution. So anybody who was using the internet was using Bind. And then it kind of became the de facto DNS server. There are other, I know there's like a Power DNS and things like that, but at Bluehost, we still use Bind. It still does everything that we need. Okay, OpenSSH. We love OpenSSH. It's really cool. When I was in school, SSH came on the scene, trying to think when it was. I want to say 95, 96 maybe. But up until that point, anytime you wanted to log into another system, like a Unix system or even a Linux system, you would use the Telnet protocol. Telnet would be listening on port 23, and you'd connect to that port, and you get a username prompt, you type in your username, then you get a password prompt, you type in your password. But there was no encryption whatsoever. This was all being sent over the wire in the clear. So anybody who had the ability to intercept traffic going over the wire would see your username, would see your password. In addition, nowadays when you set up a local area network, you use network switches. Back then, everybody used hubs. And so any traffic that went to any port on the hub would get repeated out to every other port. So you didn't even need to do anything fancy to intercept the traffic. All you had to do was put your computer into capture mode, and you were capturing all the traffic on the network. So it was really easy to capture people's usernames and passwords. So Telnet was an FTP still, people still using FTP. I don't know why, because it sends passwords and usernames across the network in the clear. So people started realizing, well, we've got to do something about this. We've got to come up with some secure alternatives, something that uses encryption. And yeah, as the internet opened up, I mean, the mid-90s, the internet was becoming less and less of just an academic and research project. It was starting to open up to commercial interest. Anybody and their dog was, buying a modem and getting on with AOL, which at the time, America Online was the internet to the majority of people. They say, what version of the internet have you got? I don't know, I got a new one in the mail. They get a floppy disk. So in 1995, this guy, whose name I have no idea how you pronounce it, Tatu Yalonen, released SSH, and he formed a company called SSH Communications. And in the beginning, Tatu was, very, very much about sharing his code, inviting people to make changes, make improvements, because this is all about security, and the best way to improve your security is to let people, get more and more eyeballs on the code, identify bugs, fix them, and so forth. So SSH encrypted console sessions, replacing Telnet. It encrypted file transfer, replacing FTP and RCP, and lots of other uses. You can forward traffic over ports, stuff like that, and that's awesome. SSH1, the first implementation of SSH, had some limitations. So in 1996, Tatu released SSH2, and along with SSH2, he also bundled in a new license. And the new license was not compatible with the GPL. It restricted what you could and couldn't do, and so forth. And I think he started wanting to charge site licenses. So if you're an institution like BYU, you'd have to pay tens of thousands of dollars to be able to use SSH on campus. So the OpenBSD folks said, we're not going to stand for that. They downloaded an earlier version of the SSH, and they forked it basically, and created OpenSSH, and they implemented the SSH2 protocol, And I don't know if SSH Communications is still in business, because why use their product when you can use the open source OpenSSH? So then there's the story about open source as a term. Up until this point, this is the mid to late 1990s, nobody was calling this stuff open source. Some people would say freeware, some people would say free software, like Richard Stallman wanted everybody to say free software. They would say, it's not free as in beer, it's free as in speech. That's the difference. Because free means something different to us as Americans than other countries where they think of libre as, it's free as in your freedom. But in America, when you think free, the first thing you think of is, oh, it doesn't cost anything. So that was the real problem with free software. People didn't think that meant what it was intended to mean. So in 1996, Eric Raymond, who was an early hacker of sorts, publishes an essay called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. Now, earlier I mentioned Netscape. Netscape had a browser, and it quickly became the most popular web browser available. And then Microsoft kind of figured things out, and they said, we're going to create a browser called Internet Explorer. And so they had Internet Explorer for Windows 95. People were using that, but it wasn't anywhere near as nice as Netscape's browser. So I'm actually going to get to this. Yeah, I actually do get to this in this. Okay, so in 1998, Microsoft did something that I considered at the time downright evil. They said, we're going to take Internet Explorer and we're going to make it part of the operating system. So if you have Windows 98 on your computer, there's no way you can get around the fact that you have Internet Explorer installed. Now, that doesn't mean you can't install another browser like Netscape or Opera or something alongside it, but why do that when there's an Internet Explorer icon right there from the time you install Windows at all? So a lot of people in the open source community were ticked off at Microsoft because Microsoft bolted a web browser to the operating system, something that had never been done before. And Netscape, of course, started losing market share big time. People were just using the browser that came with the operating system and not downloading Netscape.
Were people more proponent towards Netscape and liked it more than Internet Explorer, especially those who were actually new?
Yeah, the techies love Netscape.
Okay.
But Microsoft continued to make improvements. They were behind the game, but they were catching up. So Eric Raymond writes this essay called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, and it talks about why business should consider open sourcing their products that had up to that point not been open sourced at all. And he says, many eyeballs tame complexity. And he makes the case for a lot of different kinds of software, you should just release the source and invite people to participate in development. In 1998, Netscape, some folks at Netscape read his essay and they see the light. And they say, we don't see a future in trying to beat Microsoft at this game. So we're just going to throw in the towel. Netscape is going to dissolve. And our employees are going to kind of scatter to different places. Most of them went to Mozilla Corporation. And Mozilla took over, they took Netscape, they open sourced as much as they possibly could, because some of the stuff in Netscape was, that they had licensed from other partners and whatnot. But they open sourced it, they created the Mozilla browser. And this is a directly result of Eric Raymond's essay. So at the same time, open source as a term is born because people didn't like Stallman's free software. And in 1998, Stallman and Bruce Perens and some other people formed the Open Source Initiative. Okay, who's used OpenOffice or LibreOffice? It's awesome, right? So yeah, back back in the late 90s, I found out about this cool Office suite that you could use to read and write Microsoft Word documents, and it's some German company, and so it's called Star Division, and you could download it, and then in 1999 it was acquired by Sun Microsystems, and then Sun saw the light just like Netscape did, and they said, we're going to open source this, and they created OpenOffice, and then 10 years later the OpenOffice project kind of fell into ruin. There was all kinds of management issues, and LibreOffice was forked off of that. Part of it was because Sun was in charge. Sun was then bought by Oracle, and there's all kinds of politics there.
Not to mention that their CEO looks like a blonde fellow. Yeah. Look him up on Wikipedia sometimes. It's kind of funny.
Okay, so that's my presentation, but I did want to show off some books here that I have read that I find, if you're into this stuff, Rebel Code, that's this one right here, by Glenn Moody. This was written in the, I want to say maybe 2001 is when it came out. Yep, 2001. Covers the rise of Linux. And Linus Torvalds has a book. It was probably ghostwritten with his help, but it's called Just for Fun. Some of you may have seen this one. It's called Hackers by Stephen Levy. He's, I think he works for the New York Times. But this, you look at this and you think, oh, this is about people that break into computers. No, this is about the classic definition of hacking, which is just tinkering. And it starts with the guys at MIT that wanted to automate their little model railroads, and so they started putting together circuits and software to do that. Good book. And then if you're interested in how the internet got started with the ARPANET, I highly recommend this book, Where Wizards Stay Up Late, and it's by Katie Havner. It's really interesting the stuff that they went through just to get that first 5-node network spread across the United States. The University of Utah was one of them. They had these huge, refrigerator-sized switches, essentially. That's all they were, was networking switches. And they were all wire-wrapped circuit boards. It's pretty crazy. And then if you want to go on YouTube, here's the book on Grace Hopper. Really, really interesting. You want to learn about early computing. Like I told you about that electromechanical computer, the Mark II, that they used in World War II to decrypt German Enigma messages. Grace Hopper. And then there's a couple of videos. There's this video, The Code, the Story of Linux, and then Revolution OS. Those are both on YouTube. You can watch them. They're about an hour long. Learn about the history of Linux itself. Any questions about history? Yeah.
There's been a lot of talk about open source software, but what have you observed with more open source hardware? Like, I know Arduino, I guess kind of Arduino is kind of the poster child of all of that right now, but what in other ways have you seen that evolve?
With the open source hardware? I'm not as familiar with the open source hardware movement, but I will say that it seems like that started to reach critical mass with the advent of 3D printers. Because at that point, you had people that were building their own 3D printers and sharing the designs for that. And then the 3D printer itself kind of became a marketplace for designs. You can go to Thingiverse and download your CAD drawings for pretty much anything you want to print on a 3D printer. As far as electronics projects go, yeah, I would say the Arduino is probably the starting point. But then I would say the Pi takes it up a couple of, significant notches, because the Pi runs Linux. So it marries, open source hardware with open source software. The Arduino who's worked with the Arduino before? Yeah, it's not really an operating system so much as it is you have kind of an execution loop, and you can give it like some C-like code to run within that execution loop. But with the Raspberry Pis, you're full on. It's Linux. You can SSH in. You can run a graphical interface if you want. It's pretty versatile that way. That's a good question. I should find out more about that. Find out what the history is and where it's going. There's a couple of really good documentaries on YouTube about 3D printers and the companies that rose up to create those. Any other questions, comments? Yeah.
So you said Mac OS is based off of Unix?
It's BSD.
BSD.
Yeah.
So how did that happen?
Well, as I understand it, let's see if I remember this right. So if you used a Mac before about 2000, they had their own operating system called Mac OS. And it was I think it was a 32-bit operating system. Might have only been a 16-bit operating system. But it was highly graphical. It wasn't anything like Unix at all. And Apple was, at this point, they had fired Steve Jobs because he wasn't running the company the way that the board of directors liked. And then they invited him back when they realized that they were going even worse. So Steve Jobs came back to Apple, and he had been working with a company called Next. And Next had workstations. They were kind of like Sun Microsystems or Silicon Graphics. And so Next had these workstations, and that's what they did. And they ran this operating system that was BSD based. So when Steve Jobs came back to Apple, he said, what we need to do is this Mac OS thing it's served its purpose, but it's not going to take us where we want to go. And so they came out with Mac OS X, which was right around 2000, and it's BSD. And they could have tried a lot harder to make it backwards compatible, but I think they realized that only that the pain of moving from Mac OS to OS X, it's only going to be a couple 3 months. So there were some people that hurt making that transition, but for the most part, I think it's been really good for Apple to move that direction. Anything else? Okay, cool, thanks.
Thank you.